It was a late-night shift at the diner, and exhaustion clung to me like the damp night air. The drive home was familiar, a stretch of dark, winding roads through dense forest, occasionally broken up by small parking lots and mom-and-pop shops. It was a quiet night, the rain drizzling steadily, misting the windshield as my wipers swished back and forth. As I approached a dimly lit deli parking lot, something caught my eye, a figure standing alone beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. A woman, her arm raised, waving me down. I hesitated. A lone hitchhiker at this hour? But as my headlights illuminated her, I saw she was older, maybe mid-50s, with a tall and thin frame. The rain had soaked her through, her clothes clinging to her frail body. Against my better judgment, I slowed and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" My voice barely carried over the rain. The woman nodded fervently, rushing over and yanking open the passenger door. "Oh, thank you, sweetheart. You're a real hero," she gushed, climbing in. Her voice was gravelly, and I noticed her teeth, or rather, the gaps where some should have been. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. "Just up the way into town," she said, her voice laced with an odd excitement. I noticed the way she sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Water dripped from her sleeves onto my seat, and I fought back the irrational discomfort that bloomed in my chest. Trying to shake it off, I pulled into a gas station at an intersection a few miles down. "I'm just gonna fill up," I said. "Do you want anything from inside?" She shook her head, her thin lips curling into a smile. "No, thank you, dear." I grabbed my wallet and stepped inside, taking a moment to shake off the strange tension coiling in my gut. When I returned, my car was empty. The passenger door was shut, no sign of the woman. I scanned the lot, but she was gone. Just like that. A sense of relief washed over me. Maybe she just had somewhere to be. Maybe she had found someone she knew. Or maybe I was just overthinking. But I wasn't. The drive home was quiet. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the dark trees that lined the road loomed taller than before. By the time I reached my apartment, the unease had dulled to a quiet hum in the back of my mind. I locked the door behind me, tossed my keys on the counter, and popped a melatonin. Sleep didn't come easy, but I blamed the leftover adrenaline. My thoughts drifted to the woman, wondering where she had gone. Then I heard it. A noise. A creak. Just outside my bedroom. I held my breath, my pulse hammering. Probably the tenant upstairs. Yeah, just the neighbor. Then a shadow moved. A figure, crouched in the corner of my room. My throat closed. My body locked up. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I forced myself to move, to react. I shook my head violently, slapped my own cheek to shake off the nightmare that surely wasn't real. Then the figure stood up. A tall, thin shape, its movements eerily smooth. Silent. It walked out of the room. Not a word. Not a sound. Just gone. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. I sat frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house was silent. No footsteps. No doors creaking open or shut. Nothing. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed my dad's number. "Trish, what's wrong?" His voice was groggy, confused. I think I saw someone in my room." There was a pause. Then, "You probably had a night terror, honey." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just exhausted, my brain playing cruel tricks on me. Still, I left my bedroom light on. Still, I locked my door. Morning came, and with it, a fragile sense of normalcy. I brewed coffee, got dressed for the gym, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. But when I reached for my door, I froze. It was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I knew it. The dread in my stomach turned to something sharper. My breaths came faster. I checked the apartment, every corner, every closet. Empty. I convinced myself I had just forgotten. I went outside, unlocking my car, preparing to put my gym bag in the back seat. Then I saw it. The back seat floor, stained with damp, yellow-brown marks. And my blanket, gone. My stomach dropped. That woman, she had never left. She had hidden in my car, slipped into my home when I wasn't looking. I slammed the car door shut, my body moving on autopilot as I backed away. I called my dad again. "What do I do?" "Check if anything's missing. If nothing is, the cops won't do anything," he sighed. I checked. Nothing. Nothing but the missing blanket. But something had been taken. My sense of safety. My peace of mind. I skipped the gym. I stayed locked in my apartment, heart pounding at every creak and shadow. By the end of the month, I had found a new place. I never saw that woman again. But every night since, I've wondered how long had she been watching me before I noticed. Story 2. It was a night that should have been nothing more than a blur, just another reckless party, another story to laugh about later. But that night, I learned what true terror felt like. Michael had convinced me to go to a house party with him, despite my initial hesitation. It was one of those crowded, hazy affairs, loud music, the smell of alcohol hanging thick in the air, people stumbling over themselves in a drunken stupor. At some point, I lost track of time. The drinks were too strong, my vision too foggy, my limbs too uncoordinated. Michael was nowhere to be found. My phone was in his car at his insistence, and I was stranded. My only option was to walk home, a decision I would come to regret. The autumn air was sharp against my skin as I stumbled down the quiet road, the darkness stretching endlessly ahead of me. The few cars that passed didn't stop. I was cold, tired, and still too drunk to think straight. Then, finally, salvation, a gray truck slowed down beside me. The window rolled down, revealing an older man with a grizzled beard and sunken eyes. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. Relief flooded me. "Yeah," I slurred. "Just up the road. My house is a few miles away." I climbed into the passenger seat, the warmth of the truck soothing my frozen skin. The man nodded and pulled back onto the road. The ride started off normal enough. He asked how I ended up alone this late, but my answers were sluggish, my words barely coherent. Then, as we turned onto the road leading to my neighborhood, something shifted. We passed my street. "Wait," I mumbled, blinking rapidly. That was my turn. The man didn't slow down. The fog in my brain lifted just enough to send a jolt of panic through me. "Hey, you missed my—" "You know," he interrupted, glancing at me with an eerie smirk. "You really shouldn't be hitchhiking while drunk. Makes you an easy target." My stomach dropped. His hand moved toward my leg. Before I could react, the piercing wail of a police siren shattered the night. Red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. The man's face twisted in shock, his grip loosening just enough for me to yank myself away. He cursed under his breath as he pulled over, unlocking the doors. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and ran. I barely made it 3 steps before a police officer was beside me, his voice sharp with urgency. "What's going on?" I turned to look at the man in the truck. His expression had darkened, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. The officer kept a firm grip on my arm as I stammered out what had happened, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cop's expression hardened. "We've been looking for this truck. Suspect in a recent store theft." The officer ordered the man out of the vehicle, and as he complied, I saw it, the sudden flash of rage in his eyes, the way his muscles tensed as if preparing to lunge. But the officer was faster. The next few minutes blurred together, cuffs snapping around the man's wrists, the cop escorting me to the safety of the police car, my body shaking uncontrollably. "You got lucky," the officer said after a moment. If I hadn't pulled him over for questioning, he trailed off, shaking his head. "You never get into a car with a stranger again. You hear me?" I nodded, too shaken to respond. That night, the officer drove me home, and I vowed never to let myself be that vulnerable again. Because I knew, deep in my gut, that if the police hadn't stopped that truck when they did, I never would have made it home. Story 3. I don't remember how I got there. One moment, I was at a college frat party, surrounded by deafening music and bodies moving under flashing lights. The next, I was waking up on the damp ground, my head pounding, my body covered in dirt. The smell of wet leaves filled my nose, and as I sat up, I realized I was outside. Not in someone's backyard. Not even near campus. I was on the side of a deserted road, a dense wall of trees stretching behind me like an endless, suffocating void. My heart stuttered in my chest. My hands frantically patted my pockets, searching for my phone, my keys, anything. Empty. Panic crept in. I had no memory of how I ended up here. The last thing I remembered was playing beer pong at the party, laughing with my friends. Then, nothing. Just blank space where my night should have been. I staggered to my feet, my legs wobbly beneath me. A single street lamp flickered a few feet away, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. Beyond that, darkness. I needed help. A car. I needed to find a car. A ride. Someone to take me back to my dorm, back to safety. I wasn't sure how long I stood there before headlights finally appeared in the distance. Desperate, I stumbled forward, waving my arms. The car slowed. I held my breath as the window rolled down, revealing a man, mid-30s, a thin goatee, sharp eyes that gleamed under the dim light. "You okay?" His voice was too soft, too careful. I need a ride, I stammered, my throat dry. Back to campus. He nodded, unlocking the door. Get in. I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I climbed into the passenger seat, the leather cold against my skin. The man asked the usual questions, where I was coming from, what had happened. I told him the truth. The party, the blackout, waking up alone. I shouldn't have. He gave a low chuckle, glancing at me sideways. Sounds like someone had too much fun. I forced a weak laugh, wrapping my arms around myself. The warmth of the car should have been comforting. Instead, it made my stomach churn. Something wasn't right. Minutes passed. The trees outside blurred together as we drove, the road stretching endlessly ahead. My campus was only a 20-minute drive from where the party had been, but we'd been driving for much longer than that. Where are we? I asked, my voice tightening. He didn't answer. My heartbeat picked up. Hey, where are we going? Still silence. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. He was staring at me, not at the road, not at his phone, at me. Then he spoke, his voice a whisper. What color underwear are you wearing? Ice crawled down my spine. My hand flew to the door handle, but before I could move, he grabbed my knee, squeezing too hard. No, I choked out, shrinking away from him. Please, just take me home. He didn't answer. He just smiled. Then the car slowed. My pulse roared in my ears. He was pulling over, stopping in the middle of nowhere. I knew what was coming. I ran. I threw the door open before the car fully stopped, tumbling onto the pavement, my hand scraping against the rough asphalt. Behind me, the driver cursed, slamming his door open. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps, branches slashing at my arms as I tore through the darkness. I could hear him, his footsteps, the snapping of twigs, the growl of frustration in his throat as he chased me. Then, suddenly, silence. I didn't stop. Not until I was deep into the woods, hidden beneath the cover of twisted branches. I pressed my back against a tree, my chest heaving, my ears straining. Nothing. Then his voice. Soft. Crooning. Come on, sweetheart. You don't have to run. Tears burned my eyes. My fingers dug into the bark. I just want to talk. A branch snapped. I clamped my hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay still. Then footsteps retreating. A car door slamming. The distant roar of an engine as he drove away. I waited and waited. When I was sure he was gone, I crept out of the trees and back toward the road. Another car passed, a different one this time. An older man, his face lined with concern. Jesus, kid, are you okay? I barely managed a nod as I climbed into the back seat this time. That night, I made it home, but I never found out how I ended up on that road, or if the man in the gray truck was the one who put me there. Story 4. The man who picked me up that afternoon seemed normal enough. A little rough around the edges, unshaven, clothes a bit shabby, but nothing that raised alarm bells. He was French, spoke only broken English, and had offered me a ride from the outskirts of Liège to Paris, where I needed to pick up my paintings from an exhibition. It was October, the kind of crisp, golden autumn that made hitchhiking feel less like a desperate move and more like an adventure. We drove for a while, engaging in small talk. His words were clumsy, and I understood only fragments. He asked where I was from, what I did, if I liked France. He laughed often, though sometimes at things that weren't funny. Then, about 30 minutes in, he reached across my lap and opened the glove compartment. At first, I thought he was reaching for a map. Instead, he pulled out a stack of passports. He handed them to me, flipping through the pages himself. The first belonged to a young woman, his girlfriend, he said, who died falling off the back of his motorcycle. The second, another girlfriend, died in a car crash. The third, brain tumor. The fourth, thrown from a horse. I nodded dumbly, my fingers tightening around the passports. My throat felt thick, my stomach cold. I am an unlucky man, he muttered. I forced a smile, handing them back. Yeah, very unlucky. That's when he made his next announcement. We take shortcut now. I blinked. Shortcut. He nodded, already turning off the main highway onto a narrow dirt road. A road that led into the woods. I swallowed hard, watching as the open field shrank away behind us. The trees grew closer, taller, swallowing the sky. Shadows stretched across the dashboard. The air inside the car seemed heavier, colder. Something about this was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. He fell silent, gripping the wheel tightly. His lips moved, but he wasn't speaking loud enough for me to hear. Then, abruptly, I don't want to speak English anymore. The sentence was harsh, in order. I pressed my lips together and nodded. The road grew narrower, the trees denser. The deeper we drove, the darker it became, like the forest itself was closing in. My fingers drifted toward the door handle. I didn't know where we were. I didn't know how far we were from the highway, but I knew I needed to get out. The car slowed. A trickle of cold sweat ran down my back. I had to make a decision. For the first time, I turned to really look at him. His hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. His lips moved rapidly, muttering something too low to hear. But his eyes were locked forward, staring into the distance. Not at the road. Not at me. Just through. And then he turned to me. It was the first time I'd seen his full expression since we'd entered the forest. And I knew. I was never going to make it to Paris. I curled my fingers around the door handle. His eyes flickered down to my hand. For a moment, time froze. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Something primitive passed between us. A moment of calculation. Could he stop me? Could he overpower me? I had the advantage. I was bigger, younger. He was wiry, but I was stronger. If I ran now, would he chase me? Would he shoot me? Would he drag me deeper into the woods, where no one would ever find me? I stared at him. He stared at me. And then the car sped up. The trees blurred past in streaks of shadow and green. The road widened. The sky returned. And just like that, we were out. Back on the highway. Back in civilization. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke. His voice was eerily casual. You stay with me tonight? I forced a chuckle. No. I have friends in Paris. He didn't argue. Minutes later, he pulled onto the shoulder of the highway. I climbed out, gripping my backpack so tightly my knuckles ached. I watched as his car rumbled off into the fading daylight. I never went to the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't speak French. Maybe because part of me didn't want to know. Years later, I told this story to a German student I was tutoring. He listened intently, then pulled out his phone and searched something. He turned the screen toward me. A photo. A name. A French serial killer, active in the early 90s. Patrice Allegra. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. It was him. All these years, I had been carrying around the memory of almost being his next victim. And all these years, I had wondered, what would have happened if I hadn't stayed silent? Story 5. The night started like any other, just another late shift at the diner, just another drive home through the dark, winding roads. I was tired but wired, that strange mix of exhaustion and jittery energy that made my hands tremble slightly as they gripped the wheel. The rain had picked up, turning the road slick, making the street lights blur into hazy orange halos. That's when I saw him. A lone figure on the side of the road, walking with his thumb stuck out. A hitchhiker. I never picked up strangers. It was a rule I had never broken. But something about him gave me pause. He wasn't the typical drifter. His clothes weren't ragged, and his face, though gaunt, wasn't weathered by years of hard living. He looked normal, harmless. So, against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I stopped. He jogged up to my passenger door, rain dripping from his shaggy blonde hair. He bent slightly, peering in at me with pale blue eyes. Thanks, he breathed. I really appreciate it. I forced a polite smile. Where you headed? Not far. Just a few miles up. That was good. A short ride. A harmless favor. I nodded. Hop in. The door creaked as he climbed and sighed, bringing the damp smell of wet earth with him. He settled into the seat, shaking out his jacket. For a while, the ride was uneventful. We made small talk. He told me his name, Ethan. Said he was coming from a friend's house. Nothing about him felt wrong. Until he started asking me questions. You live around here? I hesitated. Yeah, not too far. You live alone? I gripped the wheel tighter. I have a roommate. A lie. A necessary one. He nodded, watching me too closely. That's good. It's not safe, you know? Being alone. My stomach twisted. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, guess so. The rain continued to patter against the windshield, the wipers swiping back and forth in an endless rhythm. I tried to ignore the way he stared. Then finally, I saw it. The gas station up ahead. I gotta stop for gas, I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. Yeah, no problem, Ethan said, leaning back. I pulled into the station, exhaling slowly as I shifted into park. I turned to him. You need anything? He smiled. Nah, I'll just wait here. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keys. Something in me, something primal, was screaming. Take the keys. Take them with you. I grabbed them, stuffing them into my jacket as I stepped out. The air outside was cold, not just from the rain, but something deeper, something that made the hairs on my arms rise. I walked inside, glancing back just once. Ethan was still sitting there, still staring straight ahead. I paid for the gas, stalled, took my time picking out a drink from the fridge, but when I finally stepped back outside, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. My stomach lurched. I spun, scanning the parking lot. Nothing. No sign of him. No sign of movement. Just the rain falling steadily on the empty pavement. I swallowed hard, my pulse roaring in my ears. Slowly, I approached my car, peering through the window. The back seat was empty. I exhaled, relief crashing over me in a dizzying wave. Maybe he just got tired of waiting. Maybe he found another ride. Maybe I was just overreacting. I climbed back in, locked the doors, and drove home. By the time I got inside my apartment, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. But something still felt wrong. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I shook it off, kicked off my wet shoes, and went to bed, exhaustion finally winning. But I woke up in the middle of the night. And I wasn't alone. A noise. A soft creak from the living room. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then another sound. Closer. A footstep. I sat up slowly, my heart slamming against my ribs. The darkness in the room suddenly felt thicker. Like it wasn't just the absence of light, but something alive. Something waiting. My eyes adjusted just enough to make out the shape. A figure, standing in my doorway. I couldn't breathe. Ethan. I knew it before my brain could fully register his face. He was just standing there, his silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight leaking through my window. Watching. Waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. I moved before I could think. I lunged for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers scrambling for the switch. The room flooded with light. And he was gone. The doorway was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the room. The air was still. The apartment was silent. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. "Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking. There was someone in my room. He sounded groggy, confused. "Sweetheart, are you dreaming?" I looked around again, my skin prickling with terror. "No," I whispered. "I'm not." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning came, bringing with it an unshakable dread. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a nightmare, just my overactive imagination. But when I went outside to my car, the back seat was damp, and my blanket was missing. It hit me all at once. He had never left the car. While I was in the gas station, he had slipped into the back seat. He had come home with me. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I packed a bag, called my landlord, and told him I was breaking my lease. I moved out that week, and I never picked up another hitchhiker again.